In October of 1492, a sailor stepped onto a beach he could not name, on a continent he did not know existed, and planted a flag for a kingdom that had not sent him to find it. Within 50 years, entire civilizations would collapse. Cities larger than anything in Spain would burn. Silver from mountains in the Andes would flood across the oceans and finance wars on the other side of the world. Ships carrying American silver and Chinese silk would cross the Pacific every year in one of the first truly global trade systems in human history. The Spanish Empire connected the world faster than any civilization before it. It also helped destroy millions of lives in the process. This is not a story of simple villains or simple heroes. It is the story of a kingdom shaped by centuries of holy war that became extraordinarily good at conquest, and then built an empire so vast that the wealth it seized became impossible to turn into lasting strength. From the fall of Granada to the conquest of Mexico, from the Silver Mountain of Potosi to the burning of indigenous manuscripts, from the Manila Galleons to the final defeat off the coast of Cuba. This is the full history of the Spanish Empire, and it begins 700 years before Columbus, in a war that never really ended. Chapter 1. The Broken Kingdom, Spain before the Empire. Start with a number. 700 years. That is roughly how long the process that Spanish history calls the Reconquista lasted. The centuries-long series of wars, truces, expansions, and retreats through which Christian kingdoms gradually pushed southward across the Iberian Peninsula against the Muslim states that had controlled most of it since the early 8th century. 700 years is longer than the United States has existed by a factor of nearly 3. It is longer than the interval between the Norman conquest of England and today. It is a span of time so vast that to call it a single war is to misrepresent it almost completely. The Reconquista was not a continuous war. It was a condition, a state of civilizational contest that shaped the culture, the institutions, the psychology, and the self-understanding of the Christian kingdoms of Iberia across so many generations that by the time it ended, the habits it had created were not habits anymore. They were identity. To understand this, picture the Iberian Peninsula in the year 711. A Muslim army crosses the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa and within 7 years controls most of the peninsula. The Christian kingdoms that survive retreat to the cold mountains of the north, small and desperate and surrounded. What they do in response to that situation, across the next 7 centuries, is what made the Spanish Empire possible and what made it, in the end, impossible to sustain. They organized themselves around warfare as a spiritual vocation. They built military religious orders whose members took the vows of monks and the weapons of soldiers simultaneously. They developed a theology of holy war in which fighting for the faith was not simply permitted but actively meritorious, a service to God that earned both earthly reward and heavenly favor. They created a culture in which the highest form of masculine achievement was military, in which land was the ultimate measure of status, and in which land was acquired primarily through conquest rather than through commerce or craft. The historian J.H. Elliott, whose foundational study, Imperial Spain, published in 1963, remains one of the essential texts for understanding this period, argued that the Reconquista created a warrior aristocracy whose values were fundamentally incompatible with the commercial and productive development that sustaining a large empire eventually requires. The men who were best at taking things were not the same men who were best at building things, and the culture that rewarded taking above all else was not going to spontaneously develop the habits that building required. This is not a simple story of a backward culture. The Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista period was the site of some of the most sophisticated intellectual and cultural life in medieval Europe. The Caliphate of Cordoba, at its height in the 10th century, maintained libraries larger than anything in Christian Europe. Muslim and Jewish scholars in Andalusia were translating Greek philosophical texts, preserving knowledge that Christian Europe had lost and would not recover for centuries. Christian scholars from across Europe traveled south to learn from Muslim and Jewish teachers. The flow of knowledge moved in both directions across a frontier that was far more permeable and far more culturally productive than the military narrative alone suggests. But the cultural memory that mattered most for what came after was not primarily a memory of that intellectual exchange. It was a memory of crusade, of military orders, of kings whose legitimacy depended on demonstrating they could take land from the people they defined as enemies of God, of a spiritual economy in which organized violence for the faith accumulated merit in heaven. When you carry that memory for 7 centuries, it stops being a memory. It becomes the architecture of how you understand the world. The specific moment that translated this architecture into empire was the convergence of 2 events in the same decade. Events that seem from a distance unrelated, but that were in fact expressions of the same cultural logic operating at different scales. The first was a marriage. In October of 1469, a 17-year-old princess named Isabella of Castile married an 18-year-old prince named Ferdinand of Aragon in the city of Valladolid. The marriage was conducted in secret, without the approval of Isabella's half-brother King Henry IV of Castile, which made it legally contested under Castilian law and which required a papal dispensation whose authenticity some contemporaries questioned. It was not a straightforward beginning. It was also not simply a political transaction, though it was certainly that. The historian Peggy Liss, in her detailed biography of Isabella, published in 1992, documents a relationship marked by genuine personal regard alongside the political calculation that made the marriage necessary. What mattered for the empire was not the personal relationship, but the institutional consequence. Castile controlled the Atlantic coast, the Central Plateau, and the wool trade that formed the foundation of Iberian commercial wealth. Aragon controlled the Mediterranean ports, the commercial networks of the Eastern Sea, and significant influence over the Italian peninsula. Together they controlled something that neither had alone, which was enough concentrated power to finish what centuries of fragmented warfare had not. The union was not a merger. Castile and Aragon maintained separate legal systems, separate courts, and separate administrative structures for decades after the marriage. What unified them was the will of 2 monarchs who shared enough purpose and enough trust to act as a single political entity when the situation required it. The second event was a completion. In January of 1492, after a 10-year military campaign whose cost had strained the Castilian treasury severely, Ferdinand and Isabella accepted the surrender of Muhammad XII, the last Muslim ruler of Granada, the final Islamic kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. The keys of the Alhambra Palace changed hands on January 2nd. The Reconquista, in its formal military sense, was over. Stand in the place of any Spanish nobleman or soldier present at that moment and try to feel what it meant. Your grandparents' grandparents had been fighting this war. The identity of your people had been organized around this contest for as long as anyone could remember or imagine. And now it was finished. The enemy that had defined you was gone. The crusade that had given your culture its purpose had no more territory to reclaim. The question that completion raised, whose answer would determine everything that followed, was this: what does a crusading culture do when the crusade is over? The answer came within months, from a direction almost no one had anticipated. In March of 1492, 2 months after the fall of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. The number expelled is debated by historians, with estimates varying considerably depending on the sources and methodologies used, reflecting genuine uncertainty in the historical record rather than disagreement about the event itself. What is not debated is the composition of the group. Among those expelled were merchants, physicians, financiers, scholars, and craftsmen whose presence had been economically essential to the kingdoms that now cast them out. The decision was made from the same logic that had driven the Reconquista. Religious uniformity was worth any economic cost. Purity of faith mattered more than practical benefit. In October of 1492, 8 months after the expulsion decree, Christopher Columbus sailed west from the port of Palos with 3 ships and a theory about the shape of the world. The year 1492 was not simply the year Spain discovered the Americas. It was the year Spain finished one crusade and, without quite realizing it, immediately began another. The habits formed over 7 centuries did not dissolve when Granada fell. They were exported, still intact, still powerful, still carrying within them both the extraordinary capacity for organized collective action that had made the Reconquista possible, and the extraordinary difficulty of building something durable from what was taken, that would eventually make the empire's collapse inevitable. The men who crossed the Atlantic were not a new kind of Spanish person. They were the old kind, formed by the old culture, carrying the old values into a world that had never seen them before. What happened when those values met the Americas was not a collision between civilization and barbarism, as the Spanish told it, or between innocence and evil, as later critics sometimes framed it. It was a collision between 2 fully developed human worlds, one of which had spent centuries becoming extraordinarily capable at the specific kind of destruction that the other had no experience defending against. The sailor who stepped onto that Caribbean beach in October of 1492 was not arriving from nowhere. He was arriving from 700 years of becoming exactly the kind of person who would do what he did next. What he actually found, and what he actually did with it, was something no one in Spain had fully prepared for, and something that the world has been reckoning with ever since. Chapter 2: The Accidental Empire, Columbus, and the Miscalculation. The theory Christopher Columbus carried to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella was not that the earth was round. Educated Europeans in 1492 already knew the earth was round. Scholars had been calculating its approximate circumference since ancient Greece. And the medieval church, despite what later mythology suggested, had no serious institutional objection to a spherical planet. The question Columbus was asking was different, more specific, and more consequential in its wrongness. He was arguing that the distance sailing west from Europe to Asia was short enough to be commercially viable. He was wrong. The scholars at the University of Salamanca, who reviewed his proposal and rejected it, were right. The Earth is significantly larger than Columbus calculated. His estimate of its circumference was off by roughly 25%, a margin of error that, in practice, meant placing Asia approximately where the Americas actually are. If the Americas had not existed, Columbus and every man on his ships would have died of thirst somewhere in what we now call the Pacific Ocean, having sailed past any reasonable point of return long before reaching anything. This matters because the popular image of Columbus as a visionary who saw what others could not see inverts the actual situation. The people who rejected his proposal were not closed-minded. They were correct. Columbus was not vindicated by the logic of his argument. He was saved by the existence of a continent he did not know was there. Ferdinand and Isabella funded him not because they were convinced by his geography, which they were not, but because the cost of the expedition was relatively modest and the potential upside was enormous. If he was right, Spain would have a direct western route to the Asian spice trade, bypassing the Portuguese monopoly on the eastern route around Africa. If he was wrong, they would lose 3 ships and approximately 90 men. For a kingdom that had just spent a decade and a treasury on the Granada campaign, this was a reasonable gamble on an uncertain proposition. Columbus sailed on August 3rd, 1492, and made landfall on October 12th on an island in what is now the Bahamas. The people living there called it Guanahani. Columbus called it San Salvador and claimed it for Spain. He had been at sea for 10 weeks. He believed he had reached the outer islands of Asia. He had not. He would not learn this in his lifetime. He died in Valladolid in 1506, still insisting he had reached the edges of Asia, still arguing that the crown had cheated him of the recognition and profits his contract promised. What Columbus actually found was a world of extraordinary human diversity and complexity that European knowledge had no framework for understanding. The Caribbean islands he explored over 4 voyages carried populations that had been developing distinct cultures, languages, agricultural systems, and political structures for thousands of years. The Taino people of the larger islands, whom Columbus encountered first and described in his journal with a combination of genuine wonder and immediate commercial calculation, were not a simple or primitive society. They had agricultural systems sophisticated enough to sustain large populations across multiple islands. They had political hierarchies, trade networks, and spiritual traditions that had evolved over centuries of island life. Columbus's journal entry about the Taino from his first days of contact is one of the most revealing documents in the history of colonialism, precisely because it makes no attempt to conceal its logic. He noted their gentleness, their generosity, their physical beauty. He noted that they carried no weapons and seemed unaware of what weapons were. And then, in the same breath, he noted that they would make excellent servants and that a small armed force could subjugate the entire population. This was not a private thought that later leaked out. It was written directly into the record. Columbus understood, within days of first contact, that the people he had found were a potential labor resource. The question of what the Americas contained in terms of exploitable wealth would take years to answer. The question of who would do the work of extracting it was being answered on the beach. The system that organized this logic into an institution was called the encomienda. A Spanish colonist, known as an encomendero, was granted legal authority over a specified number of indigenous people, who were required to provide labor and tribute. In exchange, the encomendero was legally responsible for their physical protection and their Christian instruction. They would work for him. He would bring them to God. The encomienda was not invented for the Americas. It was adapted from practices already used in the reconquest of southern Spain and in the Spanish colonization of the Canary Islands in the decades before Columbus sailed. The Canary Islands had provided an early rehearsal for what was coming, including the severe decline of the indigenous Guanche population through a combination of disease, warfare, and forced labor. The lessons of that rehearsal were not learned. They were applied. What happened to the indigenous population of the Caribbean in the first 50 years of Spanish presence is one of the most catastrophic demographic events in recorded human history. The causes were multiple and interacting. Diseases to which the islanders had no prior exposure. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza among them, moved through populations with a speed and lethality that no medical tradition anywhere in the world had any framework for addressing. The forced labor system destroyed people's health and separated communities from the agricultural systems that had sustained them. Organized violence against those who resisted created conditions that made recovery from disease and disruption far harder than it would otherwise have been. Historians continue to debate the pre-contact population of Hispaniola, the island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, with estimates varying considerably depending on the methodology used and the sources consulted. What is not in serious dispute is the direction and the scale of the collapse. By the mid-16th century, the Taino population of the larger Caribbean islands had been reduced to a tiny fraction of its pre-contact numbers through a combination of forces that interacted in ways that made the total effect far worse than any single cause alone would have produced. The man who documented this most systematically, and who transformed his documentation into the most consequential moral argument of the 16th century, began his time in the Americas as part of the system he would spend the rest of his life attacking. Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 as a young man seeking his fortune. He received an encomienda. He used indigenous labor. He participated, fully and without apparent initial discomfort, in the colonial system as it functioned. Then something shifted. Las Casas described his transformation in terms of a specific moment of moral crisis in which he became unable to reconcile what he observed with what he believed about the obligations of Christian conscience. He gave up his encomienda and took religious orders. He would live for a very long time, dying around 1566 at an advanced age, and he spent those years arguing before the Spanish crown, the papacy, and anyone else who would listen, that the conquest was a moral catastrophe and that indigenous people possessed natural rights that the colonial system was systematically destroying. His most famous work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, written in 1542 and addressed directly to the future King Philip II, is a document of deliberate, controlled outrage. It does not simply assert that bad things happened. It describes specific practices, names specific places, provides specific estimates of the dead, and directs the accusation precisely at the system that authorized the violence rather than simply at the individuals who committed it. The document was used almost immediately by Spain's European rivals, particularly the English and the Dutch, as evidence of Spanish colonial brutality. This created a complication that shadows Las Casas's legacy to this day. He was a genuine moral reformer, arguing from deep conviction for the rights of people his society did not regard as fully human. He was also, inadvertently, the primary source for what became known as the Black Legend, the image of Spain as uniquely and exceptionally cruel among colonial powers, an image that served the propaganda purposes of Protestant nations building their own empires with their own forms of violence. The historical record supports a more complicated truth. Spanish colonialism was extraordinarily destructive. It was also, uniquely among the major colonial powers of the era, the subject of serious formal internal debate about its moral justification. The Valladolid controversy of 1550 to 1551. A formal debate convened by Charles V to determine whether the conquest was morally and legally permissible has no parallel in English, French, or Dutch colonial history. No English monarch ever convened a formal theological debate about whether colonizing North America was just. The Spanish did. The debate changed very little in practice, but its existence is evidence that the moral argument was not simply suppressed, it was heard, recorded, and preserved, which is how we know about it today. What the debate did not change was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 between Spain and Portugal under papal mediation, which remains one of the most breathtaking expressions of European imperial presumption in the historical record. Two kingdoms drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and divided the non-European world between them. Everything west of the line would belong to Spain. Everything east would belong to Portugal. The people who already lived in the territories being divided were not consulted. The legal framework underlying this arrangement, known as the doctrine of discovery, held that Christian monarchs had the right to claim sovereignty over any territory not already governed by a Christian ruler. Indigenous governance did not constitute real governance under this framework. Indigenous property rights did not constitute real property rights. This legal fiction, constructed in 1494 to justify a division of territory, became embedded in the foundations of international law and property rights in ways that extended far beyond the Spanish Empire. Versions of the doctrine of discovery were incorporated into United States Supreme Court decisions in the 19th century. Its residue is still present in legal arguments about indigenous land rights in courts across the hemisphere today. But in 1494, none of this long-term consequence was visible. What was visible was simpler. Columbus had found something. Spain had claimed it. And the question of what Spain would do with it was just beginning to receive an answer. The answer, when it came, would be given not by a king or a pope or a philosopher, but by a 34-year-old lawyer from a dry province in western Spain who had no major military experience, no royal authorization, and an absolute refusal to accept that the situation in front of him was impossible. His name was Hernán Cortés, and what he did next would change the world more completely than Columbus ever had. Chapter 3. The Men Who Ate Gods, The Fall of Tenochtitlan. In February of 1519, Hernán Cortés weighed anchor in a Cuban harbor without permission from the governor who had commissioned him, sailed before the order to stop him could arrive, and began moving toward a coast that no Spaniard had mapped and no European had seen from the inside. He was not supposed to be there. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, had originally authorized the expedition and then canceled it. Alarmed by reports that Cortés was accumulating too much independent authority, Cortés's response was to sail before the cancellation could be enforced, which made him, before he had fired a single shot in the direction of the mainland, technically a fugitive from Spanish colonial law. This is not an incidental detail about his biography. It explains everything about how he operated for the next 2 years. A man who has lost his legal authorization cannot rely on institutional support. He cannot call for reinforcements from a governor he has defied. He has to produce results so dramatic, so undeniable, so transformative that the crown will choose to ratify what he has done rather than punish it. This is the context in which every decision Cortés made in Mexico has to be understood. He was not executing an approved plan. He was improvising, under conditions of total legal isolation, a conquest whose magnitude he was inventing as he went. He landed on the Gulf Coast in April of 1519, with a force that historians' estimates place at roughly 550 to 600 soldiers, 16 horses, and a small number of cannons. The horses deserve particular attention because they are often mentioned as a decisive military advantage without adequate explanation of why. The Aztec Empire in 1519 was a military civilization that had been conducting organized warfare for over a century. Its warriors were experienced, disciplined, and formidably armed with weapons optimized for the specific tactical goal that Aztec military culture prioritized above all others, which was capturing enemies alive for ritual sacrifice rather than killing them outright. The horses disrupted this at a fundamental level, not primarily because of their speed, though speed mattered. The primary disruption was psychological. No one in the Aztec world had ever seen a horse. The initial encounters between Aztec warriors and Spanish cavalry produced responses that the Spanish accounts describe as something close to cognitive failure. A moment in which trained responses to military threat did not engage because nothing in their training had prepared them for this specific stimulus. That window of disruption shortened with each subsequent encounter as Aztec warriors adapted, but in the early engagements, it was long enough to matter. The woman who made everything that followed possible arrived in Cortez's life as a gift. She was one of 20 women given to the Spanish by the Tabasco people after an early military engagement, and she came speaking Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec world, as well as the Mayan language spoken on the coast. A Spanish priest named Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast years earlier and had learned Mayan during his captivity, could translate between Mayan and Spanish. Through this chain, she could speak, and Cortez could understand. Her name before the Spanish renamed her was Melanson. She is known in Mexican history as La Malinche, and she has been interpreted across 5 centuries as everything from traitor to survivor to the mother of a mestizo civilization. All of these interpretations contain something true and miss something essential. The historian Frances Cartoonen, in her careful study of Melanson's actual documented role, argues that she was not simply a translator, but a diplomatic intelligence of the first order. Someone who understood the political landscape of the Aztec world with a depth and nuance that no Spaniard could match, and whose analysis shaped Cortez's strategic decisions at every critical juncture. She learned Spanish with a speed that Cortez's own letters describe as remarkable. Within weeks, she was translating in real time, without an intermediary. Without her, Cortez could not have known that the Aztec Empire had enemies. He could not have known that those enemies were numerous, militarily experienced, and deeply motivated. He could not have known that the tribute system sustaining Tenochtitlan had created a ring of resentful subject peoples who might, under the right circumstances, choose alliance with strangers over continued submission to the empire that had conquered them. This knowledge was the actual foundation of the conquest. Not the horses, not the cannons, the knowledge that the empire had cracks, and that those cracks could be entered. The Tlaxcalans provided the first confirmation, a confederacy of warrior states that had resisted Aztec domination for decades. The Tlaxcalans occupied territory surrounded on all sides by the empire, but never absorbed into it. When the Spanish column entered their territory in late summer of 1519, the Tlaxcalans did not send gifts. They sent armies. 3 times, they attacked the Spanish force with forces numbering in the tens of thousands. 3 times the combination of Spanish firearms, cavalry, steel armor, and tactical discipline held. though the margins were narrower than the Spanish accounts typically acknowledge. Men died. Horses died. The survivors were exhausted and far from any coast. Then the Tlaxcalan leadership made a calculation that changed everything. These strangers had survived what should have destroyed them. They were clearly hostile to Tenochtitlan. The enemy of an enemy is at minimum worth talking to. By early September of 1519, the Tlaxcalans had become allies. The force that had been a few hundred surviving Spaniards was now a column that would eventually march with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors. The psychology of that transformation mattered as much as the numbers. Communities across the highlands that had been weighing the cost of Aztec submission against the risk of Aztec retaliation now had a third option. They watched a new power moving through the landscape with indigenous allies and Spanish weapons. And they made their own calculations. The great city of Cholula was the next waypoint, nominally allied with Tenochtitlan. It was also, according to intelligence that Cortés received from his Tlaxcalan allies, planning an ambush. Whether this intelligence was accurate, deliberately exaggerated, or largely manufactured to justify what the Tlaxcalans wanted to happen regardless, is a question that historians have debated without reaching consensus. What is documented is Cortés's response. He invited the Cholulan leadership to a meeting. He sealed the exits. His soldiers and their Tlaxcalan allies killed a large number of people in the enclosed courtyard. The colonial sources give figures that vary considerably and cannot be independently verified, and should be understood as estimates produced in the aftermath of traumatic violence. The message that left Cholula was unambiguous, regardless of the exact number. Cortés was not a man who would be managed, delayed, or diplomatically deflected. The road to Tenochtitlan grew quieter. Moctezuma II had been receiving reports about the Spanish since their first landing on the Gulf Coast. He had sent artists to document what they looked like, what their weapons looked like, what their extraordinary animals looked like. He had sent diplomatic delegations with magnificent gifts. He had sent messages suggesting that the journey inland was unnecessary. Each time, Cortés accepted the gifts with formal courtesy and kept walking. The question of what Moctezuma actually believed about who Cortés was has generated more historical argument than almost any other aspect of the conquest. The standard account, repeated in textbooks for generations, holds that Moctezuma believed Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, and that this theological confusion paralyzed him at the critical moment. The historian Camilla Townsend, in her detailed re-examination of the primary sources published in 2003, argues persuasively that this interpretation was largely constructed after the conquest, shaped by Spanish chroniclers who needed an explanation for why the most powerful ruler in the Americas did not more forcefully resist their arrival, and by indigenous writers navigating the complex politics of the post-conquest world. What the sources actually support is a picture of a sophisticated ruler managing an extraordinarily difficult situation with the tools available to him. Moctezuma was not confused about the nature of what was approaching. He was calculating, as any ruler in his position would calculate, how to manage a powerful unknown force without triggering a response he could not contain. His use of diplomatic language in his first meeting with Cortés, language that the Spanish translators rendered as submission and that later historians repeated as evidence of theological confusion, was almost certainly the formal rhetoric of Nahuatl diplomatic protocol that the Spanish, working through imperfect translation, systematically misread. What Moctezuma miscalculated was the timeline. He appears to have believed that the sheer demonstrated scale of Tenochtitlan would resolve through diplomacy what armies had not yet been called to address. He invited the Spanish into the city. He gave them quarters. He allowed them to see everything. Within days, Cortes made his move, using a reported incident involving Spanish soldiers on the coast as justification. He confronted Moctezuma and placed him under a form of comfortable but inescapable house arrest. The emperor of the most powerful state in Mesoamerica was now, in practical terms, a hostage. The man who had calculated that time was on his side had just run out of it. The situation held an unstable equilibrium for months. Then Cortés left. In the spring of 1520, a Spanish fleet appeared on the Gulf Coast, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for his unauthorized departure. Cortés responded by taking the bulk of his force to the coast to deal with the threat personally, leaving a soldier named Pedro de Alvarado in command of Tenochtitlan. Alvarado was not Cortés. In May of 1520, during the great festival of Toxcatl, one of the most sacred ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, thousands of Aztec nobles and warriors gathered in the courtyard of the great temple in their finest ceremonial regalia. Alvarado ordered his soldiers to seal the exits and attack. The accounts describe fighting that lasted approximately an hour. The courtyard ran red. The number of dead has never been established with precision. What was established immediately was the consequence. Tenochtitlan erupted. The Spanish found themselves barricaded in their quarters in a city of 200,000 furious people with no way out and no prospect of relief. Moctezuma was pushed before the crowd to call for calm. What happened next belongs to the category of historical events that the surviving sources, both Spanish and indigenous, describe in ways so shaped by their authors' purposes that the underlying truth is very difficult to recover. The crowd turned on him. Whether he died from stones thrown by his own people enraged at his collaboration with the invaders, or whether he was killed by the Spanish once he had ceased to be useful as a hostage, is a question that has not been resolved in 5 centuries of argument. Both possibilities are consistent with the available evidence. Cortés returned from the coast having defeated and absorbed the force sent to arrest him. Instead of a triumphant return, he found a Z. His negotiations failed. His threats failed. On the night of June the 30th, 1520, he gave the order to retreat across the Tacuba Causeway under cover of darkness. It was catastrophe. The Aztecs were waiting. Warriors in canoes materialized on both sides in the darkness. The portable bridge the Spanish had constructed jammed at the first gap and could not be moved. Soldiers trapped with nowhere to go, drowned under the weight of the gold they had refused to abandon. Horses screamed and sank. The Tlaxcalan allies who had come to trust Spanish military judgment died by the hundreds. Perhaps half of the Spanish force perished before dawn. The Spanish called it La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Cortés sat at the edge of the lake as the sun rose and wept. Then he counted his remaining forces, assessed his surviving allies, and began planning the siege that would accomplish what the occupation had not. This capacity for recovery in the immediate aftermath of catastrophic failure is the thing about Cortés that history finds most difficult to categorize. He did not process defeat as most people process defeat. He processed it as information. The siege of Tenochtitlan that he designed over the following months was a different kind of operation entirely. 13 flat-bottomed warships called brigantines were prefabricated in pieces in Tlaxcala and carried overland through the mountains by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters to the shores of Lake Texcoco. Assembled and launched in April of 1521 with cannons mounted at the bow, they gave the Spanish something the Lake City had no answer for. Mobile artillery platforms that could interdict supply lines and engage canoe fleets from distances that indigenous weapons could not reach. But something had arrived in Tenochtitlan before the brigantines did. Something that moved faster than any army, and against which no military technology and no human courage offered any defense. Smallpox reached the city sometime in the late summer of 1520, carried almost certainly by a single infected man among Spanish reinforcements who had landed on the coast months earlier. The Aztecs had no name for it. They had no prior exposure and therefore no immune response to deploy against it. Modern demographic historians, working from the available evidence with appropriate caution about the inherent uncertainties, estimate that the epidemic may have killed a very large proportion of Tenochtitlan's population in a matter of months. The emperor chosen to lead the resistance against the coming siege, Tenochtitlan, who had opposed accommodation with the Spanish from the beginning, and who was perhaps the most capable military mind available to lead the defense, died of smallpox approximately 80 days into his reign. The man who succeeded him was Cuauhtemoc, young, brave, and inheriting a city already devastated by plague and facing an enemy already constructing the ships that would complete its isolation. The siege lasted 75 days. It was urban combat of a brutality that shocked even the people conducting it. Cuauhtemoc refused to break. His warriors fought block by block, retreating through rubble they had already defended, forcing the Spanish and their allied forces to pay for every street in blood. They improvised countermeasures against the brigantines, staking hidden poles beneath the shallow water near the shore to trap the hulls. They rebuilt barricades at night that the Spanish had demolished during the day. At several points they reversed the Spanish advance, capturing dozens of soldiers who were sacrificed at the top of the great temple while their comrades watched from below. It was deliberate psychological warfare, and it briefly worked. But the arithmetic was unforgiving. The aqueducts had been cut. Food shipments had stopped. Disease continued its work. By August of 1521, survivors were drinking water from puddles and eating leather. On August the 13th, 1521, Cuauhtemoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe. A brigantine intercepted him. He was brought before Cortes and reportedly placed his hand on the conquistador's dagger, asking to be killed rather than witness more suffering. Cortes refused. The last emperor of the Aztec world was taken prisoner, and Tenochtitlan fell silent. The greatest city in the Americas had been reduced to rubble in 75 days, not because a few hundred Spaniards were militarily superior to a city of 200,000 people, because an epidemic killed the most capable military leader at the worst possible moment, because decades of Aztec tribute extraction had created a ring of enemies who supplied the labor, the intelligence, and the military force that made the siege possible, because a series of miscalculations at the moment of first contact had allowed the Spanish to establish themselves inside the city before the full weight of Aztec power could be brought to bear. The fall of Tenochtitlan was the product of converging catastrophes, not a demonstration of European civilizational superiority. Cortes ordered the ruins leveled and a European city built directly on top. The stones of Aztec temples were pried apart and used as foundation material for Spanish churches. The Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City, which stands today in the heart of the capital, rests on the foundations of the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan. The conquerors understood the symbolic meaning of that choice with complete clarity. If you worship where they worshipped, you forget what they worshipped. What was built on those foundations? and what it cost the people who were already there is a story that was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Silver Mountain Potosi and the Economy of Death. In 1545, an indigenous Bolivian man named Diego Hualpa was searching for a lost llama on the slopes of a reddish mountain in the southern Andes when he lit a small fire to keep warm and noticed something that would change the world. The heat caused a thin trickle of silver to run from the soil beneath the flames. The mountain was called Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain. Its name turned out to be the most accurate thing anyone said about it for the next 2 centuries. Within a decade of Hualpa's discovery, a city of 200,000 people had grown at the base of that mountain. Sitting at 4,100 meters above sea level in conditions of cold, thin air, and geographic isolation so severe that almost everything needed to sustain human life had to be carried in from somewhere else. Potosi was, at its peak in the late 16th century, one of the largest cities on Earth. It was larger than London. It was larger than Paris. It existed entirely because of what was inside the mountain above it. What happened at Potosi over the following century and a half is a story that requires holding 2 completely different realities in mind simultaneously, because both are true and neither cancels the other out. The first reality is that Potosi produced the financial foundation of the first genuinely global trade system in human history. The silver extracted from Cerro Rico circulated through a commercial network that connected the Andes to Europe, Europe to Asia, and Asia back to the Americas in a continuous loop of exchange that no previous civilization had achieved at this scale. The historian Dennis Flynn, whose research with Arturo Giraldez established the framework most specialists now use, has argued that the opening of the Potosi mines in 1545 was the moment that genuine global economic integration, in the sense of a single interconnected world market, actually began. The second reality is that this global system was built on a labor regime of organized human destruction whose scale the documentary record makes impossible to minimize. The system that extracted silver from Cerro Rico was called the Mita. The Spanish colonial administration had borrowed the name from the Inca labor obligation that had built the roads and terraces of Tawantinsuyu. But the similarity went no further than the name. Where the Inca Mita had operated within a framework of reciprocal obligation, in which the state provided food, tools, and social support to workers fulfilling their labor duty. The colonial Mita was a system of compulsory conscription into conditions that the people administering it knew were lethal. Adult men from indigenous communities within a defined geographic radius of Potosi were required by law to spend 1 year out of every 7 working in the mines. On paper, the Mita workers, called mitayos, received wages. In practice, those wages were frequently insufficient to cover the cost of the food, tools, and candles that the miners were required to purchase from company stores at prices controlled by the mine owners. Many mitayos ended their year of service in debt rather than with earnings. Their families followed them to Potosi because a man working underground for a year could not also tend his fields at home. And a family that lost its agricultural labor for a year needed whatever income the mines provided, however inadequate. The conditions inside the mountain were lethal by any measurement. The shafts descended hundreds of meters into rock, where the air held barely enough oxygen to sustain consciousness during heavy labor. The mercury amalgamation process, introduced in the 1560s to improve the efficiency of extracting silver from lower-grade ore, required miners to work in direct contact with liquid mercury and to breathe mercury vapor in enclosed spaces with no ventilation. Mercury poisoning produces a specific and terrible progression. Tremors, neurological damage, organ failure, and death. On a timeline measured in years for someone with sustained high exposure, the total death toll of the Potosi Mita system is a figure that honest scholarship cannot state with precision. Because the documentary record does not permit accurate calculation, the writer Eduardo Galeano, in his influential book, Open Veins of Latin America, published in 1971, cited a figure of 8 million deaths associated with Potosi over the period of its operation. This number has been widely repeated in popular accounts, but is regarded by most academic historians as impossible to verify from the available sources and likely represents the upper range of a very wide set of estimates rather than a documented count. What the historical record does establish, through census data, tribute records, and administrative correspondence, is that the indigenous population of the regions supplying Mita labor declined catastrophically during the period of intensive silver extraction. Through a combination of disease, overwork, mercury poisoning, and the destruction of the agricultural and social systems that communities depended on for survival. The exact number may be unknowable. The direction and the scale of the catastrophe are not in serious dispute among historians. The Spanish crown was aware of the conditions in the mines because administrators and priests sent detailed reports describing them. The most comprehensive of these assessments, produced by Viceroy Francisco de Toledo in the 1570s, had acknowledged the death toll explicitly while arguing that the silver was so essential to the financial survival of the empire that the Mita could not be abolished. Toledo's position was not simply cynical, though it functioned cynically. He genuinely believed that without Potosi, the empire would collapse, and that the collapse of the empire would produce worse outcomes for the Americas than this continuation of the mines. Whether that was an argument for the mines or an argument against the empire was a question he does not appear to have seriously considered. The city that grew around the mines was, alongside its horror, a place of extraordinary vitality. 200,000 people in an environment that could support almost none of them without continuous outside supply created the kind of social intensity that every boom city in history has generated. Potosi had theaters, universities, and 36 churches built in a Baroque ornamental style, whose excess expressed both genuine religious devotion and the desire of the newly wealthy to make their prosperity visible in the most permanent medium available. The churches of Potosi are among the most extraordinary examples of colonial architecture in the Americas. They were built by the same labor system that was killing the workers who built them. This is the contradiction that sits at the center of the Potosi story and that resists any simple moral resolution. The beauty was real. The destruction was real. Both were products of the same system, and neither cancels the other out. The silver from Cerro Rico paid for the armies that Charles V used against Protestant princes in Germany. It paid for the fleet that fought at Lepanto. It paid for the Escorial, the vast palace monastery that Philip II built outside Madrid. It paid for the Armada that sailed against England in 1588. And it paid for something else. Something that the people spending it did not recognize as payment because it looked like prosperity. It paid, slowly and invisibly, for the conditions of Spain's own decline. That payment is the story of the next chapter. But to understand it, you first have to understand what happened to the silver after it left the mountain. It went into a trap, and the trap was built from the inside. Chapter 5. Faith and Empire, the Church in the New World. On the morning of July the 10th, 1562, A Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa stood in the courtyard of the Mani Church in the Yucatan Peninsula and supervised the burning of every Maya manuscript his soldiers had collected from the surrounding communities. De Landa himself later recorded that he burned 27 manuscripts, along with approximately 5,000 ritual objects. This is his own account of his own actions, recorded in his own writings. And some historians, including the scholar Inga Clendinen, have argued that the actual destruction was likely considerably larger, encompassing materials that De Landa either did not record or understated. In those burned pages was knowledge accumulated over centuries, astronomical observations, medical traditions, historical records, mathematical systems, agricultural calendars, everything that the Maya scribal tradition had preserved in written form about the workings of their world. De Landa's justification was entirely coherent within his own framework. The manuscripts contained, in his assessment, superstition and the works of the devil. Burning them was an act of mercy toward the Maya people, removing the instruments of their spiritual corruption. He was doing God's work. He later expressed regret, not about the burning, but about the methods he had used during the same period to extract confessions from Maya people suspected of continuing traditional religious practices after baptism. The torture sessions he authorized produced deaths that were legally problematic even under 16th century Spanish colonial law. De Landa was recalled to Spain to answer for those deaths, was eventually cleared of wrongdoing, and returned to the Yucatan, where he spent the remaining years of his life compiling a detailed account of Maya culture, language, calendar systems, and history that remains one of the most important sources scholars have for understanding the civilization whose written records he had burned. This is not an irony that resolves into something comfortable. It is the central pattern of the Spanish Church in the Americas, reproduced across 2 centuries and 2 continents, with variations that illuminate the pattern without changing it. The same institution that destroyed knowledge also preserved it. The same men who burned manuscripts also recorded oral traditions. The same faith that justified cultural destruction also produced the most powerful internal critique of colonial violence that the era generated. The Catholic Church arrived in the Americas not as an auxiliary to the Spanish Empire, but as a co-equal partner in the colonial project, with its own sources of authority and its own internal contradictions. Understanding its role requires holding those contradictions clearly rather than resolving them into a simpler story of either oppression or salvation. Because the historical record supports neither simplification. The legal foundation of Spanish sovereignty in the Americas rested on a papal grant, the Bull Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, granted Spain the right to colonize the newly discovered lands in exchange for the obligation to convert their inhabitants to Christianity. This made conversion not simply a spiritual goal, but the legal justification for the entire colonial enterprise. The Church was therefore not simply a moral supplement to the colonial project. It was the document on which the project's legal legitimacy depended. This created an institutional dynamic that shaped every interaction between the Church and indigenous people for 3 centuries. The priests who arrived in the Americas were simultaneously agents of a genuine evangelical mission, men who believed with complete sincerity that they were saving souls from eternal damnation, and administrators of the legal justification for a system of labor extraction and territorial seizure. When those 2 roles conflicted, as they frequently did, the resolution was rarely simple and never permanent. The first generation of missionary friars approached their task with an intensity that can only be described as urgent and total. Many of them believed, drawing on prophetic traditions within medieval Christianity, that the discovery of the Americas signaled the approaching end of history, and that the conversion of the indigenous peoples of the New World was the final task required before the return of Christ. This conviction gave their work an urgency that overrode practical and ethical considerations that might otherwise have restrained them. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who arrived in Mexico in 1529 and spent the next 60 years in the country, represents this paradox in its most extreme and most instructive form. His explicit motive for learning Nahuatl, interviewing indigenous elders, and documenting Aztec culture in extraordinary detail was evangelical. He believed that to combat indigenous religion effectively, he needed to understand it thoroughly. The result of that belief was the 12-volume Florentine Codex, one of the most comprehensive surviving sources available for understanding pre-conquest Aztec civilization. The man trying to replace a culture created the most complete record of it that exists. The conversion campaign that the Church conducted across the Americas produced results that were genuinely difficult to evaluate then and remain genuinely difficult to evaluate now. The friars reported millions of baptisms in the years immediately following the conquest. More recent scholarship, including the work of Inga Clendenin on Maya responses to Christian conversion, has suggested that what the Spanish interpreted as indigenous conversion was frequently a strategic accommodation of Christian forms that preserved indigenous content within a Christian exterior. Indigenous people learned which prayers to say and which gestures to make in front of which authorities, while maintaining the practices and beliefs that the Spanish believed they had replaced. This produced something that was neither the conversion the friars intended nor the simple resistance that colonial authorities feared. It produced syncretism, the fusion of Christian and indigenous spiritual traditions into something new that belonged entirely to neither source and that served the actual spiritual needs of people navigating the destruction of their world. The Virgin of Guadalupe is the most famous example and the most consequential. The apparition of the Virgin Mary, reported to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in December of 1531, on the hill of Tepeyac, north of Mexico City, on the same hill where the Aztec earth goddess Tonantzin had been worshipped before the conquest, became within decades the central symbol of Mexican Catholic identity. Scholars, including the historian David Brading, have noted that the image is often interpreted as carrying echoes of Tonantzin, representing a blending of Christian and indigenous spiritual traditions that resonated with populations that straight-line European Catholicism could not reach. Whether the apparition was a genuine religious experience, a deliberate construction by the Church to ease the transition to Christianity, or something that emerged organically from the encounter between two spiritual traditions, is a question that faith and scholarship answer differently, and that the financial evidence cannot definitively resolve. What is clear is that the Virgin of Guadalupe created something genuinely new, a form of Catholic devotion that was recognizably Christian in its forms and deeply rooted in the specific cultural and emotional world of Mexico, that has remained the most powerful single religious symbol in Mexican culture for nearly 5 centuries. The social architecture that the Church administered alongside its spiritual mission was more straightforwardly an instrument of colonial control. The Sistema de Castas, the caste system that organized colonial society into a hierarchy of racial and ethnic categories, was administered partly through the Church, which maintained separate institutional structures for different social categories and collected fees for sacraments that were, in practice, unavoidable. The Inquisition formally exempted indigenous people from its jurisdiction on the theological grounds that people not raised as Christians could not be held to the same standard of doctrinal compliance as baptized believers. This exemption was genuinely protective in some respects, while concentrating Inquisition resources on the Spanish, Creole, and mixed-race populations as a tool of social control among the colonial ruling class. The Jesuits, who arrived in the Americas later than the other orders and established their most distinctive presence in the frontier regions of Paraguay and the Amazon basin, developed a colonial mission model that differed significantly from the encomienda system operating in the core territories. The Jesuit reductions protected indigenous people from the worst abuses of the labor extraction system, while creating a form of total institutional dependency that substituted Jesuit authority for indigenous self-governance. When the Jesuits were expelled from the Spanish Empire in 1767, their mission communities collapsed rapidly. The indigenous populations they had organized and protected were absorbed into the colonial labor system from which the missions had partially shielded them, with results that demonstrated both how much the Jesuit system had provided and how little it had built in terms of the capacity for independent community life that the people inside it would need when the institution was gone. The argument that runs through the entire history of the Church in the Americas is the same argument that Las Casas made before the Council of Valladolid, and that has never been fully resolved. What did the conversion obligation actually require? If it required genuine consent and genuine understanding, then the mass baptisms of the conquest period were not conversions at all, and the legal foundation of Spanish sovereignty they were supposed to provide was hollow. If faith could be transmitted through cultural forms, even when the original theological content was imperfectly understood, then the syncretic Catholicism of the Americas was a genuine expression of Christian faith, and the mission had succeeded in ways its architects had not anticipated. The Church never resolved this argument. It kept producing, on one side, men like De Landa who burned what they could not understand, and on the other side, men like Sahagún who spent their lives trying to understand what they had been sent to replace. Both impulses came from the same institution, the same faith, the same set of convictions about what human beings owed each other before God. What the Church built in the Americas, alongside the destruction and the manipulation and the extraordinary intellectual labor of the missionary generation, was an institutional presence of extraordinary durability. The Catholic faith became the deepest common cultural ground across the entire former Spanish Empire, surviving independence, revolution, and the collapse of the colonial system that had introduced it. The faith and the empire arrived together. The empire is gone. The faith is the thing that remained. Chapter 6. The Habsburg Machine: How You Govern Half the World. In the spring of 1522, a royal administrator named Rodrigo de Figueroa sat in his office in Hispaniola and opened a letter from Madrid that had taken 3 months to arrive. It contained instructions for resolving a land dispute that had already been settled by the local courts 2 months earlier, in a manner directly contrary to what Madrid was now ordering. He read the instructions carefully. He noted the royal seal. He wrote back explaining that the situation had already resolved itself. He knew that his reply would take 3 months to reach Madrid. He knew that whatever Madrid said next would take 3 more months to return. By the time the correspondence cycle completed, nearly a year would have passed, and the original dispute would be a fading memory. He set the letter aside and turned to the next one. This was the daily reality of governing an empire that spanned continents in an era when the fastest communication moved at the speed of a sailing ship. It was not a problem that any administrator, however capable, could solve through superior organization. It was a structural constraint built into the nature of what the Spanish Empire was attempting to do. And understanding it is essential to understanding why the most elaborate bureaucratic system in the early modern world was simultaneously the most comprehensive and the most regularly paralyzed. The man who inherited this system in 1519 was 19 years old, had grown up speaking French, had been educated in Flanders, and had never set foot in Spain. His name was Carlos. History knows him as Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Charles I of Spain. He was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella on his mother's side, and the grandson of the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian I on his father's side, which made him the beneficiary of two of the most consequential dynastic marriages in European history, both arranged before he was born. What he inherited was staggering. Spain itself, with its American colonies, the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, the Duchy of Milan, the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, the Austrian Habsburg lands, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor, giving him nominal authority over the patchwork of German principalities covering Central Europe. He controlled, at least on paper, a larger share of European territory than any ruler since Charlemagne. He was 19 years old. He spoke no Spanish. He was about to have to govern an empire spread across 3 continents using communication technology that made genuine centralized management structurally impossible. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, was the central administrative body for all of Spain's American territories. It reviewed legislation, heard appeals from colonial courts, oversaw the appointment of every significant colonial official, regulated trade, and produced the Recopilación de Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, a comprehensive legal code for the colonies that ran to thousands of individual provisions. Every decision that required council approval traveled across the Atlantic twice, once as a request going to Madrid, once as a ruling returning to the colonies. In urgent situation, by the time Madrid had ruled on what to do, the situation that had prompted the request had often already resolved itself, one way or another, without waiting for Madrid's opinion. This was not an occasional frustration. It was the permanent condition of imperial governance. The viceroys, who administered the 2 great territorial divisions of Spanish America, New Spain in the north and Peru in the south, were the most powerful men in the colonial world outside of Spain itself. They represented the king in person, wielded enormous executive authority, and were expected to maintain the loyalty of populations spread across geographic scales that no administrative system in European history had previously attempted to manage. They served terms typically of 3 to 5 years, long enough to understand their territory and short enough, in theory, to prevent them from building independent power bases that might challenge Madrid's authority. The system for checking that power was as elaborate as the power itself. The residencia was a formal judicial review at the end of every senior official's term, in which any person wronged by the official's decisions could bring a formal complaint before a reviewing judge. The visita was an unannounced inspection that the Crown could launch at any time to investigate suspected misconduct. The audiencias, high courts established in the major colonial cities, had both judicial and administrative functions and maintained direct communication channels with Madrid that bypassed the viceroy entirely. The practical effect of all this overlapping supervision was not, in most cases, greater accountability. It was caution taken to the level of institutional paralysis. An official who knew that every decision would eventually be reviewed by people in Madrid who understood his territory only from documents learned to avoid decisions that could be questioned. Risk aversion was rational for anyone who wanted to survive his residencia without ruinous fines or criminal charges. The bureaucracy that resulted was extraordinarily good at maintaining existing arrangements and extraordinarily poor at responding to situations that the existing arrangements had not anticipated. Charles governed this system for nearly 4 decades, traveling constantly between his various territories, conducting military campaigns against France and Italy, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against Protestant princes in Germany, and against his own rebellious subjects in the Netherlands. He never achieved the universal Christian monarchy he genuinely desired. He did manage to hold together a territory of staggering complexity through a combination of personal presence, dynastic loyalty, and the financial resources that American silver was beginning to provide in significant quantities. In 1556, exhausted by decades of warfare and administrative struggle, Charles abdicated. He divided his inheritance between his son Philip, who received Spain, the Netherlands, and the American colonies, and his brother Ferdinand, who received the Austrian Habsburg lands and the imperial title. Then he retired to a monastery in Extremadura, where he spent his final years tending a garden and attempting, by multiple accounts, to get several clocks to run simultaneously at exactly the same speed. He could not manage it. The clocks kept diverging no matter how carefully he adjusted them. A man who had governed more of the world than any European ruler since Rome found, in a small monastery room, the same problem he had been unable to solve at imperial scale. The parts kept going their own way. No amount of attention and adjustment could make them agree. Philip II, who inherited Spain in 1556 and ruled it until his death in 1598, was his father's opposite in almost every way that mattered for governance. Where Charles had governed through personal presence and constant movement, Philip governed through paper. He read everything that came to him. He annotated it in the margins in a small, careful hand. He made decisions slowly and with great deliberation, and then implemented them through a bureaucratic apparatus that was already the most elaborate in Europe. He rarely left the Iberian Peninsula after returning from the Netherlands in the 1550s. He built the Escorial, the vast palace monastery complex outside Madrid, and from it he attempted to manage the largest empire in the world. Every letter that arrived from the Philippines had spent months at sea before it reached his desk. Every response he sent would spend months more before it arrived. He was, at any given moment, governing a situation that was already 4 to 8 months in the past. Yet, Philip's Spain was the closest thing the 16th century produced to a global superpower in the modern sense. The Portuguese crown fell to Philip in 1580, adding Portugal's Asian and African trading empire to the Spanish complex. For a period of roughly 2 decades, the unified Spanish-Portuguese Empire controlled more of the world's trade routes and more of the world's mapped territory than any political entity in history. The Manila Galleon trade, established as a regular commercial route in 1565, completed the first genuinely global commercial circuit in human history. Silver from Potosi crossed the Pacific to Manila, purchased silk and porcelain from Chinese merchants, and returned to Mexico and on to Spain. For the first time, the economies of the Americas and Asia were directly connected by a regular, organized, commercial relationship, and Spain was at the center of the connection. The administrative system Philip built to manage this global enterprise generated more documentation than any previous European government had produced. The Casa de Contratación in Seville regulated all trade with the Americas, maintaining records of every ship, every cargo, and every passenger crossing the Atlantic. The colonial bureaucracy produced census data, tribute assessments, legal proceedings, and administrative correspondence in quantities that historians are still working through 5 centuries later. If information alone could sustain an empire, Spain would have been unassailable. The problem was that information traveled at the speed of ships, decisions were made at the speed of committees, and the world being governed was changing at the speed of the people living in it. Rodrigo de Figueroa's experience with that letter from Madrid was not an exception. It was the permanent condition that every colonial administrator lived within. Every day. For 300 years. Philip died in 1598 after 42 years of rule. He had defended Catholic orthodoxy, expanded Spanish territory, and created the first global trade network in history. He had also declared effective bankruptcy 4 times during his reign, left behind a state whose financial position was already beyond recovery, without changes that the empire's structure made almost impossible to implement, and bequeathed to his successors a machine of extraordinary complexity that was beginning to run faster than anyone could steer it. The clocks that Charles had been unable to synchronize in his monastery room were still running. They were just running further and further apart, and the first dramatic signal that the divergence had reached a critical point had already arrived, 10 years before Philip died, in the waters north of France. Chapter 7. The Armada, the failure that did not end the empire. In the spring of 1588, Philip II assembled one of the largest naval forces Europe had ever put to sea. 130 ships, approximately 30,000 men. He called it the Enterprise of England, and he approached it with the particular certainty of a man who had spent 40 years convinced that God was managing his affairs personally, and that sufficient faith, combined with sufficient preparation, would overcome any practical obstacle. The practical obstacles, in this case, were considerable, and the man who understood them most clearly was not Philip. The Duke of Parma was the finest military commander Spain had produced in a generation. He had been systematically reconquering the rebellious southern Netherlands for years, and he understood military logistics with the precision of someone whose career depended on getting them right. When the Armada plan was presented to him, he sent Philip a detailed assessment that was polite in its language and unambiguous in its conclusions. The rendezvous that the plan required between the fleet and his army was not achievable given the available harbors, the shallow coastal waters, and the certainty that the Dutch flyboats patrolling those waters would prevent any coordination between two forces that could not communicate faster than a small boat could row. He asked for modifications. Philip, governing from the Escorial on the basis of documents and conviction, ordered the fleet to proceed as planned. The fleet's commander was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, an aristocrat and capable administrator who had organized the Armada's supply chain and logistics with genuine professional competence before the fleet ever sailed, and who had also told Philip explicitly that he had no naval combat experience and that he did not believe the operational plan was sound. Philip appointed him anyway. What followed demonstrated the cost of prioritizing institutional loyalty over professional judgment, though not entirely in the way that the standard English victory narrative suggests. Medina Sidonia executed his orders with real professional skill, given the constraints he was operating under. He maintained the fleet's formation through the running battle up the English Channel in late July and early August of 1588. He kept his ships from the grappling engagements that Spanish naval doctrine favored and that the more maneuverable English ships were designed to avoid. He reached the Flemish coast with most of his fleet intact, which was a more difficult achievement than it is usually given credit for being. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Francis Drake as his vice-admiral, held advantages that tactical skill alone could not compensate for. The English ships were, on average, faster and more maneuverable. Their gun crews were trained in long-range gunnery, which kept them outside the range at which Spanish boarding tactics could be employed. The Channel battle damaged both fleets without producing a decisive result. Then the English sent fireships. 8 vessels loaded with pitch, gunpowder, and anything combustible were set alight and sent downwind into the anchored Spanish fleet on the night of August the 7th. Spanish commanders, aware of a previous incident in which the Dutch had used an explosives-laden fireship to devastating effect, ordered their ships to cut anchors and scatter. The fleet that had maintained its disciplined formation through weeks of battle dissolved in hours. Without their anchors, the ships could not return to a fixed position. Without a fixed position, the rendezvous with Parma's army was impossible. Without the rendezvous, the invasion was finished. The subsequent engagement off Gravelines the following day was a genuine English tactical victory over a fleet that had lost its formation and could not recover it. Several Spanish ships were sunk or run aground. The Armada was pushed north, away from the Flemish coast and any possibility of completing its mission. Medina Sidonia made the decision to return to Spain by sailing north around Scotland and Ireland, rather than attempting to fight back through the Channel. It was the correct decision given his circumstances. He had no anchors, limited ammunition, and crews already weakened by disease and hunger. The weather that then wrecked roughly a third of the Spanish fleet as it rounded Scotland and Ireland was not divine intervention on behalf of Protestant England, though English propaganda immediately framed it as precisely that. It was an exceptionally severe North Atlantic storm season, encountering ships already damaged, overcrowded with sick men, and navigating waters they had not mapped. Many of the men who survived the sinkings and reached the Irish coast were killed by English allied authorities or by local populations whose own complicated circumstances under English rule gave them reasons to calculate their responses to Spanish survivors. Of the 130 ships that had sailed from Lisbon, approximately 60 returned to Spain. The human cost was severe, with disease, storms, and combat combining to kill the majority of the 30,000 men who had sailed. Philip's response to the news, by multiple accounts, was composed rather than devastated. He is reported to have said that he had sent his fleet to fight men, not storms, a formulation that served simultaneously as theological acceptance and as a reassignment of blame that preserved his own judgment from criticism. He ordered the construction of replacement ships. He launched 2 more armadas in the 1590s. Both were scattered by storms before they could engage the English fleet. He interpreted the storms as trials of faith rather than evidence that the strategy was unsound. The standard historical narrative treats the Armada's failure as the beginning of the end of Spanish naval supremacy. This significantly overstates what the defeat meant in the short term. Spain rebuilt its Atlantic fleet within a decade. The silver continued to flow from Potosi. The colonial empire was not threatened in any direct way, because England in 1588 lacked the capacity to challenge Spain in the Americas. What the Armada's failure actually demonstrated was more subtle and more consequential than a simple shift in naval power. Spain could maintain its empire. It was becoming unable to deliver the decisive military outcomes against determined challengers that maintaining an empire at this scale eventually required. The Netherlands, where the War of Independence from Spanish rule had been grinding on since the 1560s, continued to absorb enormous Spanish military and financial resources without resolution. The Dutch Republic that was emerging from that conflict was simultaneously building the commercial and financial infrastructure that would eventually challenge Spanish trade dominance across the globe. The Armada had not created Dutch commercial power, but it had demonstrated that England would remain a secure base for Dutch resistance and Dutch commerce, which was strategically decisive in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. It is worth pausing here on something that the English victory narrative consistently omits. The Spanish did not simply accept the Armada's failure as a permanent strategic verdict. They rebuilt. They adapted. They continued to project naval power in the Atlantic for another century. The empire did not begin falling apart in 1588. What 1588 revealed, to those willing to look clearly, was that the empire's power had a ceiling that the silver from Potosi was temporarily concealing. Above that ceiling, Spain could not reach. Below it, Spain could still operate with formidable effectiveness. The distance between the ceiling and the floor was what the next century would measure. Philip II died in 1598, 10 years after the Armada, and 10 years before the full consequences of its failure became impossible to ignore. He left his successors an empire that was still the largest in the world, a bureaucratic system that was still the most elaborate in Europe, and a financial position that was already beyond recovery, without structural changes that the empire's inherited values made almost impossible to implement. The machine kept running. The clocks kept diverging. And in the gap between the empire Spain had built and the empires its rivals were building, a future was being assembled that no one in Madrid could clearly see, partly because of the distance, and partly because the silver from Potosi made it very comfortable not to look. Chapter 8. The Silver Trap: Why Wealth Destroyed Spain. Picture a merchant in Seville in the year 1570. He is not poor. He is not struggling. By almost any measure available to him, he is living in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country in the world. The ships that arrive at the port of Seville carry silver in quantities that would have been unimaginable to his grandfather. The streets around the Casa de Contratación are busy with factors and agents and notaries, processing transactions that connect his city to every corner of the known world. The cathedral being built nearby is the largest in Christendom. The King of Spain is the most powerful monarch on earth. And yet, if this merchant is paying careful attention, something is wrong. The bread he buys costs more than it cost 10 years ago. The cloth he needs to resell costs more than it cost 10 years ago. Everything costs more than it cost 10 years ago. And the rate at which prices are rising is accelerating rather than slowing. He is receiving more money for his goods than his father received. He is also paying more for everything he needs than his father paid. Whether he is actually better off is a question he cannot easily answer, because the unit he is using to measure his situation, money itself, is changing its meaning beneath his feet. What this merchant, without the conceptual vocabulary to name it, is inflation driven by monetary expansion. The largest monetary expansion in European history, produced by the largest influx of precious metal into any economy since ancient Rome. And it is, slowly and invisibly, doing to Spain what no enemy army had been able to do. The economist Earl Hamilton, whose research, published in 1934, established the foundational framework for understanding this period, documented a sustained price rise across the Spanish economy over the 16th century that he attributed primarily to the influx of American silver. Prices in Spain roughly quadrupled over the course of the century. This was not uniform across all goods or all regions, and subsequent economists, including John Tapasquet, Herbert Klein, and Henry Kamen have refined and, in some cases, complicated Hamilton's analysis. But the core pattern is not seriously disputed. The silver that made Spain rich in the conventional sense, in terms of the quantity of money circulating through its treasury, also made Spain expensive in ways that had structural consequences no amount of military power could reverse. The specific mechanism that turned monetary wealth into productive weakness was straightforward in retrospect and invisible in the moment. As Spanish prices rose faster than prices in the rest of Europe, Spanish manufactured goods became progressively more expensive relative to goods produced in England, France, the Netherlands, and the Italian city-states. A Spanish wool cloth that had been competitive in European markets in 1520 was priced out of those same markets by 1570. Not because Spanish weavers had become less skilled, but because the silver flowing through the Spanish economy had raised the cost of everything that went into producing the cloth. The labor, the raw materials, the transportation, the financing. Spanish consumers, including the Spanish crown itself, responded rationally. They bought foreign goods. Why pay more for Spanish cloth when Flemish cloth was better and cheaper? Why develop Spanish manufacturing when American silver could simply purchase what manufacturing would have produced? The rational decision for every individual actor in the Spanish economy was precisely the decision that, made collectively across thousands of transactions every day, was quietly destroying the productive capacity of the entire country. The historian Jan de Vries, in his analysis of the Dutch Golden Age, describes this as the central distinction between wealth that compounds and wealth that depletes. Productive investment, investment in skills, machinery, institution, and knowledge, generates returns that accumulate and improve over time. Consumptive spending, spending on goods, military campaigns, and displays of status, generates no return beyond the immediate satisfaction. Spain, receiving silver in quantities that made consumptive spending more attractive than productive investment, systematically chose consumption. The silver that passed through Spanish hands left behind cathedrals, armies, and the memory of power. It did not leave behind the mills, the trading companies, the financial instruments, or the skilled labor force that convert resource wealth into durable economic strength. The contrast with the Dutch Republic is not a story about national character or cultural virtue. The Dutch did not make wiser choices than the Spanish because they were inherently wiser people. They made different choices because they faced different constraints. A small republic fighting for its independence against the most powerful military in Europe, with no silver mines and no colonial revenues to speak of, had to develop the most sophisticated financial system in Europe simply to survive. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, established in 1609, and the trading infrastructure that supported it were not expressions of Dutch cultural genius. They were survival mechanisms, tools that a people with no alternative built because having no alternative concentrates the mind with remarkable efficiency. Spain had an alternative. It had the silver, and having the silver meant the pressure to build what the silver was temporarily making unnecessary never became urgent enough to overcome the institutional inertia and the cultural values that worked against it. Those cultural values matter here in a way that economic analysis alone cannot capture. The Spain that produced the conquistadors was a society that had spent centuries elevating military achievement and land ownership above commerce and manufacture as measures of status and as paths to social advancement. A man who grew rich through trade was in the social hierarchy that the Reconquista had shaped. less admired than a man who had taken land from an enemy of God. The merchants and financiers who might have built the productive institutions that Spain needed were operating in a cultural environment that regarded their activities as less honorable than the activities of soldiers and priests. The expulsions of the Jews in 1492 and the Moriscos in 1609 removed from the Spanish economy precisely the communities that had historically specialized in commerce, craft production, and financial services. The Morisco expulsion alone, involving an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 people by most historians' assessments, produced immediate and documented agricultural disruption in the regions they had farmed. Regions where they had maintained the sophisticated irrigation systems of the former Muslim kingdoms of southern Spain. Crops failed. Fields went unworked. Communities that had depended on Morisco agricultural and craft labor found themselves without it and without any rapid means of replacing it. The decision to expel was made from the logic of religious purity that the Reconquista had embedded at the center of Spanish political culture. It was, by the standards of that logic, entirely coherent. By the standards of economic rationality, it was an act of deliberate self-harm whose consequences unfolded over decades in ways that the decision-makers could not or would not see clearly. The cost structure of empire itself was the final element of the trap. Maintaining military forces across multiple continents and multiple seas, administering a bureaucratic apparatus of the scale Spain had built, fighting the seemingly endless wars in the Netherlands, Italy, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean that the logic of empire required, consumed revenue at a rate that the silver could not sustainably supply even at its peak. Philip II declared effective bankruptcy 4 times during his reign. His father, Charles V, had done so twice before him. His successors would do so again. These were not simple failures of financial management. Though the financial management was genuinely poor by the standards of the era's most sophisticated practitioners, they were the predictable result of a strategic commitment that exceeded the resources available to sustain it, made by rulers who believed that the silver would keep coming in sufficient quantities to cover the gap between expenditure and revenue. For a time, it did. Then it did not. Potosi's silver production peaked in the 1590s and declined steadily thereafter as the richest veins were exhausted and extraction costs rose. By the mid-17th century, silver production had fallen to roughly half its peak output. The financial gap that silver had been bridging was no longer being bridged. The debt that had been accumulating across a century of deficit spending was coming due faster than any new revenue source could address it. The Spain of the mid-17th century was not the Spain of Philip II in any sense that mattered economically. The population had fallen. The manufacturing sector had contracted. The commercial and financial institutions that England and the Dutch Republic had built from the pressure of necessity were absent in Spain in anything like comparable form. The empire was still vast. Its revenues were still larger than those of any rival. But the ratio of revenue to the cost of maintaining what the revenue was supposed to maintain had been deteriorating for generations. And deteriorating ratios, unlike sudden crises, do not produce the alarm that might trigger corrective action until the deterioration has gone too far for correction to be straightforward. The wealthy merchant in Seville in 1570 could not see what was happening to him. He could see the silver. He could see the ships. He could see the cathedral. He could not see the Dutch merchant in Amsterdam who was taking the same silver and turning it into something that would outlast every cathedral Spain would ever build. Wealth is not the same as strength. Spain was about to spend the next century and a half learning this lesson in ways that no amount of silver could prevent and no military victory could reverse. Chapter 9. The Forgotten Empire, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Here is a fact that most popular histories of the Spanish Empire either omit entirely or mention in a single sentence and move past without examining. Spain governed the Philippines for 333 years. 333 years. The United States has existed for fewer than 250. The entire British presence in India lasted less than 2 centuries. Spain's colonial relationship with the Philippine archipelago lasted longer than either, and it shaped the language, the religion, the legal system, and the cultural identity of a nation of over 100 million people in ways that are immediately visible to anyone who visits Manila today. And yet, in the popular understanding of the Spanish Empire, the Philippines is a footnote, something mentioned briefly after the Latin American story has been told, as though the Pacific half of the empire were a minor appendage rather than a dimension of equal historical consequence. Understanding why this part of the story matters requires beginning with a death, and with the man whose death began it. In April of 1521, on the island of Mactan in the Philippine archipelago, a Portuguese navigator sailing under Spanish authorization was killed in a battle with a local chief who had declined to submit to foreign authority. The navigator's name was Fernão de Magalhães, known to history as Ferdinand Magellan. The chief who killed him is named Lapu-Lapu, and he is today a national hero of the Philippines, commemorated in statues across the country and on Philippine currency. Magellan is remembered in the Philippines primarily as the man who died there. Magellan had left Spain in September of 1519 with 5 ships and approximately 270 men, attempting to reach Asia by sailing west. The expedition found the Philippines. It found, also, that asserting authority over peoples with their own political traditions and their own reasons to resist was not a formality that local rulers would accept simply because a European navigator arrived and announced it. Lapu-Lapu's refusal and the battle that followed were not an aberration in the history of Spanish Pacific expansion. They were the pattern that would repeat itself across the following 3 centuries. A pattern in which the Spanish consistently underestimated the depth and the durability of indigenous resistance to colonial authority. The expedition continued after Magellan's death under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano. In September of 1522, the single surviving ship of the original 5, carrying 18 men of the original 270, returned to Spain with a cargo of spices and the distinction of having physically circumnavigated the globe for the first time in human history. The world had been proven to be navigable in its entirety. The question was, what to do with that knowledge commercially? The answer required solving a navigational problem that Magellan's voyage had not resolved. The winds and currents that could carry a ship westward from Mexico to the Philippines across the Pacific did not permit a straightforward return by the same route. The navigator Andrés de Urdaneta solved it in 1565 by sailing far north after leaving the Philippines into the waters off Japan. A ship could find the North Pacific Current and the prevailing westerlies that would carry it back across the ocean to the coast of California and then south to Mexico. The Tornaviaje, the return route, made the annual Manila Galleon trade possible. From 1565 until 1815, with only brief interruptions. A galleon sailed from Acapulco to Manila carrying silver and returned carrying the goods of Asia. The circuit ran for 250 years. It was the first genuinely regular commercial connection between the Americas and Asia in human history. And it connected 2 of the world's largest economic systems through a single annual exchange of extraordinary value. What moved along this circuit reveals the actual structure of the early global economy more clearly than almost anything else in this period. The outbound cargo was silver. Mexican and Peruvian silver minted into coins and bars. The one commodity that Asian markets, and Chinese markets in particular, wanted above almost everything else. China, in the 16th century, had an enormous monetary economy that ran on silver. And Chinese demand for the metal was, by any pre-modern standard, essentially limitless. According to research by the historians Dennis Flynn and Arturo Giraldez, whose systematic analysis of trade records and price data established the framework most specialists now use. Somewhere between a third and half of all the silver produced in the Americas eventually made its way to China, either through the Manila route or through the Atlantic route to Europe, and then overland through the Ottoman Empire and Persia. The returning cargoes were everything that Asia produced that American and European consumers wanted. Chinese silk in quantities sufficient to clothe the entire colonial population of the Americas and still have surplus for export to Spain. Chinese porcelain, which European manufacturers would spend the next century and a half trying unsuccessfully to replicate. Spices from the islands of Southeast Asia, cotton textiles from India, reaching Manila through the regional trading networks that connected the archipelago to the South Asian subcontinent. This means that the mines of Potosi were not simply funding the Spanish Empire. They were monetizing the Chinese economy. They were lubricating commercial networks across Asia that the Spanish crown could neither fully control nor fully comprehend. The empire was larger than the people governing it understood. In the Philippines itself, the colonial regime the Spanish established was shaped by the commercial logic of the galleon trade in ways that made it different from the American colonial model. The Philippines produced no silver, no gold in quantities comparable to the American mines, no single extractable commodity that could organize the colonial economy around a single extraction point. Its value was strategic. As the western terminus of the Pacific trade route and as a base for missionary and commercial operations across East and Southeast Asia, this different economic logic produced a colonial society unlike anything the Spanish had built in the Americas. And at the center of that society, sustaining it and threatening it simultaneously, was a man named Chen Yi. Chen Yi had come to Manila from the Fujian coast of China sometime in the 1580s, as tens of thousands of Chinese merchants and craftsmen had done in the decades since the Spanish established their colonial capital there. He worked as a carpenter in the Parian, the designated Chinese quarter outside Manila's walls, building and repairing the structures that the colonial city's rapid growth constantly required. He spoke enough Castilian to negotiate with Spanish customers. He maintained connections to the Fujian trading networks that supplied the goods the galleons carried back to Acapulco. He was, in the precise sense of the word, indispensable. He was also, by the logic of the colonial administration, permanently suspect. The Spanish colonial authorities in Manila lived with a specific and well-grounded anxiety. The Chinese population of the Parian, which fluctuated between 15,000 and 30,000 people depending on the decade and the state of trade, outnumbered the Spanish colonial population by a ratio of sometimes 10 to 1 or more. They were the skilled labor and commercial intelligence of the colonial economy. They were also beyond the kind of institutional control that the Spanish had developed for the indigenous Filipino population. They had their own community structures, their own commercial networks, their own reasons for being in Manila that had nothing to do with loyalty to the Spanish crown. What happened to people like Chen Yi when that anxiety tipped into violence is one of the darkest and least known chapters of Spanish imperial history. In 1603, in 1639, in 1662, and on several other occasions. Spanish colonial authorities responded to real or perceived threats from the Chinese community with organized massacres that killed thousands of people. The specific numbers given in colonial sources vary considerably and cannot be independently verified with precision. But the scale of each incident was clearly sufficient to temporarily collapse the commercial economy of the colony. And the Chinese kept returning, because Manila was too commercially valuable to abandon, and because the mechanisms that sustained the galleon trade, the connections between Chinese producers and the silver market, were older and more resilient than any colonial administration's capacity to suppress them. The Spanish could kill the Chinese merchants of Manila. They could not eliminate the Chinese commercial networks those merchants represented. So they would rebuild, and the Parian would fill again, and the anxiety would accumulate again, and the pattern would repeat. Chen Yi survived. His sons were born in Manila. His grandsons spoke Castilian as naturally as they spoke Hokkien. The Manila that emerged from 3.5 centuries of Spanish colonial rule was shaped as much by people like him as by the governors and priests and soldiers whose names appear in the official records. The North African dimension of Spanish imperial power reveals something important about the full geographic ambition of what Spain was attempting and the cost that ambition carried. Spain maintained fortified positions along the North African coast, including Oran, Melilla, and Ceuta, from the early 16th century onward. These presidios were strategic positions in the long struggle for control of the Western Mediterranean against the Ottoman Empire and its North African client states. They were expensive to maintain, regularly attacked, occasionally captured and recaptured, and consistently regarded by the Spanish government as peripheral to the main business of governing the Americas. The Battle of Lepanto in October of 1571 was the most dramatic expression of Spain's Mediterranean ambitions and the most consequential naval engagement of the 16th century in that theater. A Holy League fleet, assembled under Don John of Austria, met the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras, off the western coast of Greece. The engagement involved roughly 500 ships and perhaps 150,000 men on both sides. The Holy League victory was comprehensive. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed, losing approximately 200 ships and 30,000 men. It was the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean since antiquity, and it checked Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean in ways that the subsequent decades confirmed. Miguel de Cervantes, who would later write Don Quixote, fought at Lepanto as a young infantryman and was wounded, losing the effective use of his left hand. He considered it the greatest day of his life. But Lepanto did not end the wider Mediterranean struggle. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within 2 years, demonstrating a productive capacity that Spain could not match. The pirates operating from Algiers, Tunis, and other North African coastal cities continued to raid European shipping and coastal communities for another century and a half after the battle. The victory was real and consequential. Its strategic reach had limits that the scale of the triumph could not permanently conceal. Ceuta and Melilla remain Spanish sovereign territory today, which makes Spain the only European Union member state with land borders on the African continent. Their existence as Spanish territory in the 21st century is a geographic consequence of decisions made in the 15th and 16th centuries for reasons that have long since ceased to be relevant, maintained by the institutional inertia that makes empires easier to acquire than to relinquish. Now step back and hold the full geographic extent of the empire together. Mexico and Peru and the Caribbean islands, the Philippines, The North African Presidios. The Manila Galleon trade, connecting the Americas to Asia. The Mediterranean fleet. Spanish missionaries reaching into Japan, Taiwan, and the Pacific Island groups. Trading contacts with China, India, and the Spice Islands. This was not an Atlantic empire with some Pacific additions. This was the first genuinely global system in human history, attempting to manage commercial, military, and religious relationships on 4 continents simultaneously, with communication technology that made genuine centralized management impossible, and administrative technology that made decentralized adaptation nearly as difficult. The galleons kept sailing until 1815, 250 years of the same circuit, the same exchange, the same commercial logic. The world around that circuit had changed completely. The Dutch had built a commercial empire in Asia that challenged Spain's position from the early 17th century onward. The English East India Company was reshaping the economic geography of the Indian Ocean. The Chinese economy was developing internal structures that made its relationship to outside silver supply less critical than it had been in the 16th century. Spain's Pacific Empire was not declining because its underlying commercial logic had failed. It was declining because the world it had been built to connect was building its own connections, in new directions and at new speeds, that the galleon system could not match. Lapu-Lapu's victory over Magellan in 1521 was the first sign of that pattern. The last galleon's final crossing in 1815 was its final expression. Between those two moments, the Pacific half of the Spanish Empire connected the world and failed to understand what it had connected. Chapter 10. The Long Decline Bourbon Reforms and the Empire's Last Breath. In November of 1700, the last Habsburg king of Spain died in Madrid after a reign of 35 years that historians have spent considerable effort trying to assess charitably and found the effort difficult to sustain. Charles II had come to the throne at the age of 4 and had never in his life been capable of the kind of sustained, clear decision-making that effective rule requires. Modern genetic studies of available historical and genealogical evidence have strongly supported the conclusion that the Habsburg practice of marrying within the family across several generations had reached biologically consequential levels by the time Charles was born. He could not chew solid food properly. He learned to walk late. He suffered from chronic illness throughout his life. The court factions that competed for influence over him understood that the king himself was not capable of resolving their disputes, and so they resolved them around him, through him. And despite him for 3.5 decades, he left behind no heir and no clear succession. A failure that would drag most of Europe into 13 years of warfare and end with a dynasty on the Spanish throne that had never governed Spain before. The War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, was fought between a coalition supporting Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the French king Louis XIV, and a coalition supporting the Habsburg Archduke Charles. The stakes were clear to every participant. Whoever controlled me controlled the American silver and the Pacific trade routes that had sustained European commerce for a century and a half. Philip of Anjou won, becoming Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king of a dynasty that would rule Spain with one brief interruption for the next 3 centuries. His victory came at a price. The Treaty of Utrecht required Spain to cede Gibraltar and Minorca to Britain, to surrender its Italian territories to Austria, and to grant Britain the asiento, the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies. along with the right to send one ship annually to trade directly with Spanish America. These concessions represented something that 3 centuries of naval rivalry had not previously secured for Britain, which was commercial access to the Spanish colonial system. The war that Spain had fought to preserve its empire had ended by opening that empire's edges to the power most capable of eventually replacing it. What the Bourbon dynasty brought to Spain was something the late Habsburgs had conspicuously lacked: a willingness to examine the empire's structural problems rather than simply inherit them. The Bourbon reformers of the 18th century were men shaped by Enlightenment thinking, by the application of rational analysis to political and economic institutions, and by the observation that Spain's rivals were generating more wealth and more power from smaller territories than Spain was generating from the largest empire in the world. The reason for this gap was not, they correctly understood, a mystery. It was a set of institutional choices that could, in principle, be changed. Consider what the empire looked like to José de Galvez, the man Charles III appointed as Visitador General to New Spain in 1765. He arrived in Mexico City with a mandate to assess and reform the colonial system. And what he found was an administration that had been operating on the same basic institutional logic since the 16th century. Tax collection was inefficient and captured by middlemen. Trade was strangled by regulations that had made sense in 1580 but were economically absurd in 1765. The colonial military was poorly organized and inadequately equipped. The church held land and revenue that the state could not touch. Galvez spent 5 years in the colony, traveling to every significant region, compiling reports, firing incompetent officials, and building the case for a systematic overhaul. What he proposed, and what Charles III largely implemented, was one of the most ambitious administrative transformation programs in the history of the Spanish Empire. The Comercio Libre, the free trade policy gradually implemented between 1765 and 1789, opened colonial trade to multiple Spanish ports rather than routing everything through Cadiz as the old monopoly system had required. The effect on colonial trade volumes was dramatic and largely positive. Buenos Aires, which had previously been accessible for trade only through the long overland route from Lima, became a major Atlantic port almost immediately when direct trade was permitted. Venezuela and New Granada developed rapidly once the commercial restrictions that had isolated them were lifted. The intendancy system, adapted from French administrative practice, replaced the old colonial officials with professional administrators who were better paid, more directly accountable to Madrid, and explicitly tasked with promoting economic development alongside their traditional administrative functions. The colonial military was reorganized and expanded. The church's tax exemptions were challenged, though never fully eliminated. The total volume of colonial trade increased substantially over the decades following these reforms, demonstrating that the old monopoly system had been suppressing economic activity that was genuinely there to be released. By the standards of 18th century imperial administration, the Bourbon reforms were a genuine achievement. But the reforms carried within them a contradiction that Galvez himself, sitting in his office in Mexico City, compiling his reports, was not fully equipped to see. The same Enlightenment ideas that were driving his administrative modernization were also circulating through the colonial educated classes in ways that raised questions the reformed empire had no good answers for. The Creoles were the American-born descendants of Spanish settlers who ran the colonial economies, owned the agricultural estates and mining operations, staffed the lower levels of the colonial administration, and provided the social and intellectual leadership of colonial urban life. They were, by the late 18th century, a distinct social and cultural group with their own identity and their own reading habits. They read Montesquieu and Locke and Adam Smith. They observed the American Revolution of 1776 with careful attention. They absorbed the vocabulary of natural rights and the consent of the governed. The Bourbon reforms gave the Creole elite more economic freedom while continuing to deny them political equality. The highest administrative and ecclesiastical offices remained reserved for peninsulares. Spaniards born in Spain. The Creoles could be wealthy. They could be educated. They could run the economic machinery of an empire. They could not govern it at the highest levels, because the imperial system that employed them continued to regard them as inherently less trustworthy than people born on the other side of the Atlantic. This distinction was not a new policy. It had been present from the beginning. What was new was that the Creoles now had the intellectual vocabulary to articulate why it was unjust, and the economic resources to imagine what independence from it might make possible. The crisis that converted these intellectual conditions into political action came not from within the empire, but from Europe. In the summer of 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte summoned the Spanish royal family to the French city of Bayonne and forced them to abdicate. He placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Spain itself erupted in resistance. The brutal guerrilla conflict that the Peninsular War would become, but the Spanish government that organized that resistance had no established legal claim to colonial loyalty that the colonial elites were required to accept. The question that the events of 1808 forced on every colonial capital across Latin America was the most fundamental political question an empire can face. If the legitimate government has been overthrown, to whom does loyalty belong? The Bourbon reforms had improved the empire's economic performance without creating the political institutions through which this question could be answered within an imperial framework. There was no colonial parliament. There was no mechanism for the Creole elite to express political preferences short of rebellion. The empire that the Bourbons had modernized economically had remained, politically, a structure of authority flowing in one direction, from Madrid to the colonies, with no legitimate channel for it to flow in the other direction. When Madrid ceased to function as a source of authority, the channels through which the colonies connected to it ceased to function too. What remained was the Creole elite, in possession of the economic machinery of the empire, in possession of the vocabulary of rights and self-governance, in possession of colonial military forces that the Bourbon reforms had trained and equipped, and in possession of grievances that 3 centuries of colonial subordination had accumulated. The earthquake that Napoleon caused in 1808 did not destroy a healthy empire. It destroyed an empire whose foundations had been quietly compromising for a very long time. What came next was not recovery. It was the settling of accounts that had been deferred, year by year and decade by decade, since the silver first started flowing from the mountain in 1545. Chapter 11. The Children Rise Independence Across Latin America. On the 16th of September, 1810, a Catholic priest in his 60s stood in the doorway of his parish church in the small Mexican town of Dolores and rang the bell before dawn. His name was Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. He was not a revolutionary in the conventional sense. He was a parish priest who had been running an illegal book club, importing forbidden Enlightenment texts, and who had been reported to the Inquisition more than once for heterodox intellectual interests. He had been organizing the local community around craft industries that the colonial administration discouraged. He had been, for years, someone the authorities watched, with mild concern, without finding sufficient reason to arrest. In the summer of 1810, he joined a conspiracy of Creole reformers, planning a revolt against Spanish authority. The conspiracy was discovered. The planned date was moved up. On the morning of September the 16th, with arrest imminent, Hidalgo made a decision that changed the course of Mexican history. He rang the church bell, assembled whatever congregation appeared, and called on them to act. What he said has been debated ever since, because no contemporary transcript of his words survives. The Grito de Dolores, the cry of Dolores, has been reconstructed from accounts written afterward and shaped by the political needs of the people who wrote them. What is documented is the effect. Within hours, Hidalgo was leading a crowd. Within days, that crowd had become a movement numbering in the tens of thousands, drawn primarily from the indigenous farmers and mestizo workers of the Baguio region, people whose relationship to the colonial system was not the Creole elite's frustration with political exclusion, but the daily experience of poverty, land dispossession, and legal subordination. The movement that Hidalgo unleashed alarmed the Mexican Creole elite almost as much as it alarmed the Spanish colonial authorities. The crowd sweeping through the Baguio was not simply demanding political reform within the colonial system. It was attacking the material conditions of colonial society, the haciendas, the granaries, the structures of economic power that the Creole elite owned and depended on. This was not their revolution. This was something they feared as much as they desired change. Hidalgo was captured, tried, defrocked, and executed by firing squad in 1811. His head was displayed in an iron cage at the corner of the Alhóndiga de Granaditas for 10 years. A deliberate statement of colonial authority that failed to suppress the movement he had started. The resistance continued under the leadership of another priest, José María Morelos, who proved himself a more systematic military strategist. Before Morelos himself was captured and executed in 1815, Mexican independence finally arrived in 1821, but not through the popular revolution that Hidalgo's Grito had initiated. It arrived through a conservative political maneuver by a Creole military officer named Agustín de Iturbide, who had spent years fighting the insurgency and who switched sides when a liberal revolution in Spain itself threatened to impose reforms on the colonies that the Mexican conservative establishment found more threatening than independence. Iturbide united the remaining insurgent forces and the conservative colonial military under the Plan of Iguala, which promised independence while explicitly preserving the privileges of the church and the existing social hierarchy. Mexican independence in 1821 was, in the most precise sense of the term, a conservative revolution. It separated Mexico from Spain in order to preserve the social arrangements that a reforming Spain might have disrupted. The church kept its properties. The Creole landowners kept their estates. The racial hierarchy was formally abolished in the independence documents and practically maintained in the social arrangements that independence left entirely untouched. The experience in South America was shaped by figures whose intellectual ambitions went considerably further, though the practical results were similarly constrained by the social realities of the societies they were trying to transform. Simon Bolivar was born in Caracas in 1783 to a wealthy Creole family. Educated partly in Europe, where he absorbed Rousseau and Voltaire and witnessed the aftermath of the French Revolution, and returned to Venezuela with convictions about human equality and natural rights that exceeded what most of his social class were prepared to accept. His campaigns to liberate the northern half of South America, conducted across 15 years of extraordinary hardship, are among the most remarkable military achievements in the history of the Americas. The passage of his army across the Andes in 1819, moving through mountain passes at altitudes where horses died of altitude sickness and soldiers wrapped their feet in animal skins to cross ice fields, produced a surprise attack on Spanish forces in New Granada that the historian John Lynch, in his comprehensive study of the Spanish-American Revolutions published in 1973, describes as one of the decisive moments in the entire independence period. It was not simply a military crossing. It was the moment when the independence movement demonstrated that it could operate at a scale and a boldness that colonial authority had not anticipated and could not easily contain. Bolivar dreamed of a unified Spanish-American republic, a Gran Colombia that would be capable of standing as a genuine peer to the United States and the European powers. He understood that the individual nations emerging from the collapse of the Spanish Empire were too small and too economically underdeveloped to exercise genuine independence in a world where Britain was building a commercial empire that would seek to fill whatever vacuum the Spanish system left. He was right about the danger. He was unable to build the institutions that would have addressed it. The Gran Colombia he created from the liberated territories of Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador fell apart into three separate nations by 1830, the year he died. In his final months, having resigned the presidency he had fought to create and watching the political reality of the societies he had liberated systematically override the ideals that had driven him, Bolivar is reported to have written that he who serves a revolution plows the sea. The image carries the specific exhaustion of a man who understood, at the end, that the forces he had unleashed were larger than any individual, including himself, could control or direct toward the future he had imagined. He died in December of 1830 at the age of 47, in a borrowed house in the Colombian city of Santa Marta, far from the capital of any of the nations he had created, José de San Martín, whose campaigns liberated Argentina, Chile, and Peru, was a more practically focused figure, a professional soldier who had served in the Spanish army before returning to his native Argentina to join the independence movement. San Martin understood military logistics in ways that allowed him to plan operations that his opponents consistently underestimated. The crossing of the Andes in January of 1817, leading approximately 5,000 men over mountain passes in the southern hemisphere summer, was an achievement that military historians have compared to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, and found the comparison apt. San Martin and Bolivar met in Guayaquil in July of 1822 in what remains one of the great mysteries of South American history. No verified transcript of their conversation exists. The accounts written afterward reflect the political purposes of the people who wrote them, rather than the precise content of what passed between the two men. What is documented is the outcome. San Martin resigned his command shortly after the meeting and retired to Europe, where he lived until 1850, watching from a distance as the nations whose independence he had helped secure navigated the turbulent decades that followed. The independence of the Spanish-American mainland was essentially complete by 1825, when the last major Spanish military force in South America surrendered following the Battle of Ayacucho in December of 1824. Cuba and Puerto Rico remained Spanish colonies, their Creole elites calculating that the risk of a slave rebellion similar to the Haitian Revolution made alliance with Spain preferable to independence. The Philippines remained Spanish, but the Continental Empire was gone. What replaced it was not what most of the people who had fought for independence had hoped for. The wars of independence were extraordinarily destructive, killing large numbers of people and disrupting the agricultural and commercial systems that had sustained colonial economic activity. The political institutions that independence created were fragile, contested, and frequently overwhelmed by the social and regional conflicts that the colonial system had suppressed without resolving. The economic pattern that followed independence was particularly telling. British merchants and bankers moved into the commercial vacuum that the collapse of the Spanish colonial trading system created with a speed and sophistication that demonstrated how thoroughly the structure of the colonial economy had prepared the ground for exactly this kind of external commercial penetration. The new nations needed credit. British banks provided it. They needed manufactured goods. British factories supplied them. They had raw materials to export. British commercial networks absorbed them. The pattern of exporting primary commodities and importing manufactured goods, which had characterized the colonial relationship with Spain, continued with British commercial interests, replacing the Spanish crown as the primary external beneficiary of the arrangement. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed by the United States in 1823, announced that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization. It was not primarily designed to protect Latin American independence, though was framed in those terms. It declared, in effect, that the Western Hemisphere was an American sphere of influence, and that the Spanish imperial system was being replaced not by genuine independence but by a different kind of hemispheric order, one managed from Washington rather than from Madrid. The children who rose against the empire inherited its structures along with its territories. The land remained concentrated in the hands of the families that the colonial system had placed in possession of it. The racial hierarchy that the colonial system had built into the legal and economic fabric of society did not dissolve when independence was declared. The questions that Hidalgo's church bell had raised before dawn in 1810 were not answered by independence. They were passed on, generation by generation, to the people living in the nations that independence had created. Some of those questions are still being asked today. Chapter 12, 1898. The Last Ship. On the morning of July the 3rd, 1898, Admiral Pascual Cervera y Topete gave an order he knew was a death sentence for the fleet under his command. He had communicated this knowledge to his superiors in Madrid in writing, with the specificity of a man who understood exactly what he was facing and wanted the record to show that he had said so. He had described the condition of his 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers: damaged, undermanned, short of ammunition, and blockaded in Santiago Harbor on the southern coast of Cuba by a United States Navy squadron whose firepower exceeded his own by a margin that left no room for tactical skill to compensate. He had explained, in terms requiring no specialized military knowledge to understand, that sailing out of that harbor was not a military operation with an uncertain outcome. It was a controlled destruction, conducted in the open rather than in port, to satisfy the honor of a navy and a government that had run out of alternatives. Madrid ordered him to sail anyway. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba lasted approximately 4 hours. According to American naval records, 343 Spanish sailors died. 1 American sailor died. Cervera was rescued from the water by an American vessel and treated with the formal courtesies that naval tradition extended to defeated commanders. He was, by every account, a capable officer placed in an impossible situation by superiors who found it politically preferable to lose a fleet visibly than to surrender a harbor quietly. The destruction of Cervera's squadron ended the Spanish-American War as a practical military matter, though the formal conclusion came with the Treaty of Paris in December of 1898. Under the treaty's terms, Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States, receiving $20 million for the Philippines in a transaction that both parties understood was less a purchase than a formula for transferring sovereignty without requiring the word surrender to appear in the text. In 8 months, Spain lost the last significant remnants of the empire that Columbus had initiated 406 years earlier. The war that produced this outcome requires careful examination, because the version that American national mythology has preserved is significantly incomplete in ways that matter for understanding both its causes and its consequences. Cuba had been in a state of armed revolt against Spanish rule since 1895, a genuine popular movement with deep roots in Cuban society, particularly among the Afro-Cuban population that made up a large proportion of the revolutionary forces. Spain's response included a policy known as reconcentration, which forcibly relocated large portions of the rural Cuban population into fortified camps to deny the insurgents the support of the countryside. According to contemporary accounts and subsequent historical research, disease and malnutrition killed people inside these camps at rates that alarmed humanitarian observers at the time, and that American newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, covered with a combination of genuine outrage and calculated sensationalism designed to drive American public opinion toward intervention. The explosion of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February of 1898, which killed 266 American sailors, provided the emotional catalyst that converted public outrage into political pressure for war. A naval inquiry in 1898 attributed it to an external explosion, consistent with a mine. A subsequent analysis commissioned by the United States Navy in 1976 attributed it to an internal explosion, consistent with an accidental munitions accident. The historical consensus today leans toward the accidental explanation, though certainty is not possible given the physical evidence available. What drove the United States to war was not primarily the Maine, but the accumulation of factors that the Maine's destruction crystallized into political action. The acquisition of the Philippines was the aspect of the peace settlement most debated in the United States, both at the time and subsequently. The Philippines had not been part of the original American war aim. Its inhabitants had been fighting their own independence war against Spain and expected that defeating Spain would produce independence. They found themselves instead facing a new colonial power. The Filipino-American War that followed, lasting from 1899 to 1902 in its main phase and continuing in various forms of resistance for years afterward, produced casualty figures that remain contested among historians. American military records documented approximately 4,200 American soldiers killed, Filipino combatant and civilian deaths from combat, disease, and the disruption of food supply systems are estimated in ranges that vary considerably depending on the methodology used and the sources consulted, and should be understood as approximations rather than precise counts. The United States, which had entered the Spanish-American War, framing itself as a liberator of colonized peoples, fought a colonial war in the Philippines that employed methods, including the forced relocation of civilian populations, that the American government had criticized Spain for using in Cuba. The gap between the rhetoric of liberation and the reality of colonial administration was not uniquely Spanish or uniquely American. It was the gap that every colonial power in history has navigated between the principles it claimed and the practices it employed. But recognizing it clearly is essential to understanding what 1898 actually represented in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Cuba received nominal independence under the Platt Amendment of 1901, which gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it judged intervention necessary, a formulation vague enough to justify intervention whenever American interests required it. The United States intervened militarily in Cuba in 1906, 1912, and 1917. The Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, also established under the Platt Amendment, remains American territory today, a geographic consequence of 1898 that has survived every subsequent transformation of Cuban-American relations, including the Revolution of 1959 and decades of economic embargo. Puerto Rico received neither independence nor a clear path to statehood. It became and remains an unincorporated territory of the United States, a status whose constitutional ambiguity has generated more than a century of political argument without resolution. The people of Puerto Rico are American citizens but cannot vote in presidential elections if they reside on the island. They are subject to federal laws. They have no voting representation in Congress to shape. Their political status is, in the precise sense of the word, colonial, a term that American political discourse has consistently resisted applying to Puerto Rico, while the structural reality it describes has remained unchanged for more than a century. In Spain, the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in 1898 was experienced as a national trauma that restructured intellectual and political life for a generation. The writers who came of age in the aftermath, known collectively as the Generation of 98, confronted a question that the loss of empire had made impossible to defer. What was Spain without its empire? What was Spanish identity without the global mission that 4 centuries of colonial power had provided? The novelist Miguel de Unamuno, the philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, and the poet Antonio Machado produced work animated by this question, a sustained meditation on national identity and historical failure that was unlike anything produced by the intelligentsia of a nation experiencing success. They did not find comfortable answers, but they found honest ones, which is the more valuable thing. Admiral Cervera survived his fleet by 11 years. Dying in 1909, he had time to write his memoirs, to see the Philippines organized as an American colonial possession, and to observe the Filipino-American War that followed the transfer of sovereignty. He appears, from the accounts of people who knew him in his final years, to have regarded the outcome of 1898 with the equanimity of a man who had understood the situation clearly before it resolved, and who had long since made his peace with what understanding it clearly had cost him. He had sailed his ships into the guns of a superior force because Madrid had ordered him to. He had lost his fleet because the empire had spent the resources that might have made the fleet competitive on other things for a century before it asked him to fight. He had done his duty in the service of a system that had been failing long before it asked him to perform the final act of its failure. The last ship sank on the morning of July the 3rd. The empire it represented had been sinking for much longer than that. Cervera simply had the misfortune of being on the deck when it finally went under, and he had the dignity to sail out and meet it, rather than wait for it to come to him. That, perhaps, was the most Spanish thing of all. Chapter 13. The Legacy. What the Spanish Empire left the world. Here is something concrete. Wherever you are hearing this right now, think about what you ate today. If you had potatoes in any form, they came from a crop developed by Andean farmers over thousands of years and carried to the rest of the world by the Spanish colonial network. If you had tomatoes, They came from Mexico. If you ate chocolate in any form, it originated in the cacao traditions of Mesoamerica. If you seasoned anything with chili peppers, those peppers traveled from the Americas through Spanish trade routes to become naturalized in cuisines, from Hungary to India to China. Cuisines now so thoroughly identified with chili heat that it is difficult to imagine them without it. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct material connection between the world the Spanish Empire created and the world you are living in today. The Columbian Exchange. The term the historian Alfred Crosby introduced in 1972 for the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and peoples between the Old World and the New World that the Spanish colonial system organized, produced one of the most significant transformations of the global food supply in human history. Historians and agricultural scientists estimate that a very large fraction of what the world eats today came from seeds that crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific in Spanish ships. The potato alone reshaped the demographic history of Europe. Brought to the continent in the late 16th century, it provided a calorie-dense crop that could be grown in conditions inhospitable to wheat and that supported population growth across the 17th and 18th centuries on a scale that the existing agricultural base could not have sustained. The Irish dependence on the potato that made the Great Famine of the 1840s so catastrophic was itself a consequence of how thoroughly the Andean crop had been absorbed into European agricultural systems in the 2.5 centuries since the Spanish brought it across the ocean. The famine that killed approximately 1 million Irish people and drove another million to emigrate was produced by the failure of a crop that had been in Ireland for less than 300 years and that had come from a civilization, the famine, Spanish had done so much to destroy. This is the character of the Spanish Empire's legacy throughout. The things it created and the things it destroyed are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from different positions within it. 500 million people speak Spanish today as their first language, making it the second most widely spoken native language in the world. It is the official language of 20 countries. It is the fastest growing language in the United States, where it is the native language of tens of millions of people and the second language of tens of millions more. The Spanish language did not spread across the Western Hemisphere because the people who already lived there chose it. It spread because the Spanish Empire imposed it as the language of administration, law, religion, and education across territories where hundreds of other languages had been spoken for millennia. But language does not remain the tool of imposition forever. It becomes, over generations, the medium through which people think, dream, argue, love, grieve, and create. The literature written in Spanish across 5 centuries, from the golden age of Cervantes and Lope de Vega in the 16th and 17th centuries to the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the poetry of Pablo Neruda and Cesar Vallejo in the 20th, represents one of the great literary traditions in any language. Garcia Marquez was not Spanish in any national sense. He was Colombian, writing from a Caribbean coastal culture whose relationship to Spain was the relationship of a grandchild to a grandparent who had done terrible things and also given you your language, your religion, and the specific texture of your imagination. The Spanish language became, through the empire that spread it, something larger and more various and more beautiful than the language of the kingdom that had created the empire in the first place. The Catholic faith follows the same pattern. It is the religious identity of the large majority of people in Latin America, practiced by populations whose ancestors were converted by force or by cultural pressure over 3 centuries of colonial rule. That origin does not make the faith less real for the hundreds of millions of people for whom it is genuinely central to their lives. What it does is make the relationship between faith and colonial history in Latin America something that cannot be discussed honestly without acknowledging both dimensions at once. The syncretic religious cultures that developed across Latin America are among the most creative responses to colonial imposition in the historical record. People who were told to abandon their gods found ways to keep something of those gods within the forms of the faith they were required to adopt. The image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which scholars including the historian David Brading have interpreted as carrying echoes of Tonantzin, the Aztec earth goddess, worshipped on the same hill before the conquest, became, within decades, the central symbol of Mexican Catholic identity. The Catholic saints of Cuban Santeria are often interpreted as incorporating the orishas of the Yoruba people brought from West Africa as enslaved laborers. The Andean festivals that follow the Catholic liturgical calendar incorporate ritual elements whose connection to pre-Columbian practice is visible to anyone who looks carefully. This is not confusion or corruption. It is adaptation of the deepest kind. The survival of a way of being in the world by finding new forms capable of carrying its essential content through conditions designed to eliminate it. The faith and the empire arrive together. The empire is gone. The faith, transformed and localized and made genuinely the possession of the people who practice it, remains. The architectural legacy is immediately visible in the historic centers of dozens of cities, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires to Manila. Colonial Baroque churches built with indigenous and enslaved African labor in the 16th and 17th centuries stand in the centers of cities that have grown around them for 4 and 5 centuries. The Zocalo in Mexico City, the Plaza de Armas in Cusco, the walled city of Cartagena de Indias in Colombia, the historic center of Havana. These urban spaces carry layers of colonial history in their stones that reward careful attention with something richer than any simple narrative of conquest or liberation can provide. The political legacy is the most contested and the most directly connected to the inequalities of the present. The borders of every nation in Latin America were drawn by the administrative geography of the Spanish Empire, following the boundaries of viceroyalties and audiencia districts that colonial administrators established for reasons of administrative convenience and that independence movements inherited without redesigning. The concentration of land in large estates, the weakness of independent commercial and professional classes, the power of the military as a political actor, the racial hierarchies that structured access to education and economic opportunity across the 19th and 20th centuries. All of these features of post-independence Latin American political economy had roots in the colonial period that independence did not cut. The argument about the extent to which these colonial roots explain the present circumstances of Latin American nations, as opposed to post-independence choices and external pressures, is one of the most contested in contemporary economic and political history. The economist Daron Acemoglu and the political scientist James Robinson have argued influentially that colonial institutions designed for extraction created self-reinforcing patterns of political and economic organization that persisted across independence and subsequent political changes. Other scholars have emphasized the agency of post-independence political actors and the role of external economic pressures in shaping outcomes that cannot be reduced simply to colonial inheritance. The debate is genuinely unresolved, and anyone who tells you it has a simple answer is offering ideology rather than history. What is not in serious dispute is that the social structures the Spanish Empire built were extraordinarily durable. The Creole elite that led the independence movements became the governing class of the independent nations. The land remained concentrated where the colonial system had placed it. The racial categories that the caste system had created persisted in social practice long after they were formally abolished in law. An empire ended. Its structures continued. The contemporary debates about statues of Columbus and the conquistadors, about formal apologies for the conquest, about reparations and restitution and historical accountability, are debates about the same question that Bartolomé de las Casas was arguing before the Council of Valladolid in 1550. Not simply what happened, but what the people living in the present owe to the people who suffered in the past, and to the people who are still suffering from conditions that the past created. Now stand at the end of this story and hold what it actually contains. A kingdom shaped by centuries of holy war, increasingly trained to understand the world as a place to be claimed, a sailor who found the wrong continent and changed everything anyway, soldiers who destroyed cities that stunned them with their beauty, a mountain that produced more silver than anyone had ever imagined and left the country that owned it poorer than the countries that merely traded with it, priests who burned libraries and spent the rest of their lives writing down what they had burned, an emperor who governed half the world from a desk and could not make his clocks run at the same speed, ships that circled the planet while their owners were still trying to understand what the planet contained, a generation of men and women who fought their way to independence and inherited the structures of the system they had defeated, the last admiral who sailed his ships into the guns of a superior fleet because honor required it, and because the system he served had been spending its strength on the wrong things for a century before it asked him to fight, the last empire that ended not with a battle but with a document signed in Paris, in a formula so familiar by then that no one present found it remarkable. The Spanish Empire burned its own legacy, not in a single dramatic act, but in 10,000 daily decisions, each individually rational within the values that produced it, collectively constituting a civilization that mistook what it was good at taking for what it was building, and spent 4 centuries discovering the difference. The difference, it turned out, was everything. But here is what the silver and the swords and the burning manuscripts could not destroy. 500 million people still speak the language that the empire spread. Hundreds of millions still practice the faith that the empire imposed, in forms so shaped by the people who received it that it no longer belongs to the people who gave it. The food that the empire carried across the oceans feeds the world today. The borders the empire drew contain the lives of an entire hemisphere. The questions the empire raised about conquest and conscience and what one people owes another are still the questions that the 21st century is trying to answer. The empire is gone. What it made remains, in all its beauty and all its damage, waiting for the people living inside it to decide what to do next. That decision is being made right now. In every election and every courtroom and every conversation about what history requires of the people who inherited it, the man on the beach in 1492 planted a flag in the sand and believed he had claimed something. What he had actually done was begin a conversation that has not yet ended. You are part of that conversation. The only question is what you choose to say.